Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me get my first 1,000 subscribers. It's one click for you, but for me it's a huge encouragement and motivation. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's go. Michael Sanders sat in his spacious office, leaning back in his padded leather chair and staring thoughtfully out the window. The streets below him were busy, but on this evening the noise seemed distant. Thoughts of the upcoming weekend swirled in his head. Ellie, the youngest daughter, had left for a school camp and wouldn't be back until Sunday, and Sophie had been at university for weeks. The silence of the house gave him a chance to return to forgotten rituals with his wife, dinner by candlelight and unhurried conversations about life. Michael looked at his watch and decided he could afford to leave work early today. He dreamed of a quiet evening with Laura, maybe a walk through the old park they loved so much. Gotta remember what it's like to just be together, he thought as he gathered up his papers and put his laptop away. The house greeted him not with its characteristic silence, but with a resounding emptiness, as if something invisible was in the air. There was no one in the kitchen, though the lights were on. Michael felt a slight unease and headed toward the bedroom. "Laura, are you home?" he shouted as he walked down the hall. The answer didn't come right away. "Yes, Michael, I'm here." He entered the room and froze. Laura was sitting at her dressing table, putting on bright lipstick. She was wearing an elegant black dress and a pearl necklace around her neck, a gift from Michael last Christmas. At her feet was an open travel bag with her belongings in it. "Wow, you look amazing," Michael said, trying to hide his confusion. "Am I forgetting something? Do we have plans for the weekend?" Laura put off her lipstick and looked at him in the mirror, her gaze focused and serious. "No, Michael, you didn't forget anything. These are my plans," she said, choosing her words with care. "I'm going away for the weekend." Michael frowned, not understanding what was going on. "What do you mean you're going away? Where?" His voice shook, though he tried to remain calm. "I have a meeting," Laura continued, standing up and turning to him. "It's just one weekend, Michael. I need it to feel like me. I thought you would understand." He took a step back as if from a blow. A muffled feeling of pain and bewilderment flashed through his chest. "Are you serious, Laura?" He looked at her, hoping she would suddenly laugh and admit it was a joke. But her gaze remained impenetrable. "Yes, I mean it," she said softly but firmly. "I have to do this for me so I don't feel empty." "For yourself? You're not planning to spend this time alone, are you? And who's this man you're going to find yourself with?" Michael's voice became sharper. He could hardly contain his anger. Laura looked away. "His name doesn't matter. We're just friends. He's married, he has kids. It doesn't mean anything. I didn't want to keep it from you, that's why I'm telling you now." "You call that honesty?" Michael whispered as if the air had gone out of his lungs. "Telling me to my face that you're going to another man is honesty? I didn't want to do it behind your back. It's just a weekend and I'll come home and everything will be back to normal." Michael stared at her in silence. Did she really believe what she was saying? As if this was some weird, twisted form of therapeutic pause after which their marriage should suddenly grow stronger. "How long have you been planning this, Laura?" he asked, feeling his face burn with anger. "A few weeks. Michael, please understand." "Understand?" He interrupted her, his voice shaking. "Understand that my wife is going to spend the weekend with another man and then come back as if nothing happened?" Laura stepped closer and put her hand on his shoulder. "It won't change anything between us. I love you, Michael. It's just that I'm tired and I need to rest. Life is going on and this constant monotonous routine is killing me. I need to unwind and then everything will be back to normal. Don't worry." He stepped back, taking her hand away. "You're wrong. This has already changed everything." There was a silence in the room that seemed deafening. Laura lowered her eyes, realizing that her words hadn't hit the mark. Michael turned and walked out of the bedroom, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. In the study, he closed the door behind him and tried to calm himself. Strong emotions came in waves, sweeping away all attempts at rational thought. He opened his phone, his fingers automatically finding an old number he had kept but not used in years. He dialed the number. "Hi, Jessica, it's Michael Sanders." His voice shook with tension and he panicked a little and dropped the call. He stood in his office, unable to shake off the stupor caused by his conversation with Laura. Her words still echoed in his head like an echo in an empty hall. He replayed the scene in the bedroom over and over again, trying to find signs that this was a nightmare that would end with the first ray of morning sunlight. But everything was reality, harsh and ruthless. The ringing of the phone brought him back to the present moment. He picked up the receiver and a familiar voice sounded on the other end. "Michael, are you still here?" Jessica's voice was as soft as ever. Yeah, I'm sorry for calling so suddenly, he said, trying to control his voice. It's just, I needed to talk. You sound worried. Is everything all right? Her concern was felt through the distance, and Michael felt the tension release a little. No, Jessica, nothing's okay, he admitted, letting himself realize the horror of what was happening for the first time all evening. Laura had just told him she was going away for the weekend with another man. There was silence, and Michael could hear her holding her breath. What? She finally said, her voice shaking. I don't believe it, Laura. I always thought you were one of the toughest couples. I thought so too, Michael grinned dryly. But I guess I was wrong. Jessica was silent, and in that silence Michael could hear her shock and sympathy. After a moment, she broke the silence. You shouldn't be alone tonight. Why don't you come over to my place? I'm cooking dinner and I have a bottle of good wine. It won't do us both any harm. Michael closed his eyes, remembering the days when they had worked together, her support and the warmth she always radiated. Maybe that's a really good idea, he said, feeling the tension in his shoulders fade. Great, I'll be waiting, she said, and there was a slight smile in her voice, a reminder of old times. An hour later, Michael stood in front of Jessica's door, his heart pounding like a teenager. She opened the door and he was greeted by a familiar, reassuring smile. Her eyes, blue and warm, were immediately filled with concern as soon as she saw his face. Come on in, she said, stepping back to let him inside. You look like you haven't slept in years. I feel about the same, Michael admitted as he entered the living room. The room was cozy, the light from the table lamp reflecting on the shelves filled with books and pictures of her son Luke. Sit down, I'll get the wine, Jessica said and disappeared into the kitchen. Michael sat down on the couch looking around. This house had an atmosphere of comfort and warmth, something he hadn't felt at home in a long time. Jessica returned with glasses of wine and sat down beside him, looking at him carefully. Tell me everything, she asked. He sighed and began to speak. The words flowed out of him like water from a broken dam. He told her about his conversation with Laura today, her revelation and his bewilderment. Jessica listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally to show she was there for him. I never thought Laura was capable of such a thing, she finally said when he was done. You always spoke of her with such love. Yes, and I did love her, Michael said, lowering his eyes to his glass. But now I don't know what to think. Jessica gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Michael, you deserve to be with someone who appreciates you, who sees you. Her voice was quiet but firm. He looked at her, feeling something in his heart respond to her words. But before he could say anything, the phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Laura. I'm sorry, I have to take this, he said, standing up and walking a few steps away. Michael, Laura's voice was agitated and almost desperate. I know you're angry and maybe I deserve it. But please don't do anything that will ruin us completely. I want to go back, I want things to be like they were before. He closed his eyes, feeling the anger and pain struggling in his soul. It's too late, Laura. You've already ruined everything, he said and disconnected the call. Is everything okay? Jessica stood up and walked over to him, her eyes full of concern. I think so, he replied, turning to her and feeling the weight of events slowly lift off his shoulders. Maybe for the first time in a long time. Jessica smiled, and they sat side by side until the night was replaced by the first light of dawn. Morning found Michael and Jessica in the living room, drowning in the soft light of dawn. They spent the night talking, reminiscing about old times, sharing thoughts about a life that had gone wrong, and finding in that conversation something long-lost: warmth, understanding, simple humanity. Jessica laughed softly, remembering an incident from work. Remember when I accidentally sent your report to the CEO with the headline, "The most boring thing you ever read"? Michael grinned too, feeling lightheaded for the first time in a long time. Oh yeah, and I spent half an hour trying to explain to him that it was a joke. Thank you for that encouragement. He smiled and looked at her gratefully. Well, it worked, she winked. Since then he's been reading all your reports to make sure they weren't so boring. For a moment, the world outside the walls of this house seemed far away, as if they'd gone back 10 years when things were simpler. But the truth of the present soon reminded itself. Michael looked away and took a deep breath. Jessica, what if she doesn't stop there? Even if she comes back, can we ever be the same again? Jessica took his hand and her eyes met his gaze. You have to ask yourself another question, Michael. Do you want things to be like they were before? After everything that's happened. He froze, realizing the weight of her words. They penetrated straight to his heart, stripping away the veil of self-delusion he tried to cover himself with. In that moment, Michael realized that the truth was not only Laura's betrayal, but that he himself had long ago lost something important about himself. I don't know what I want anymore, he said quietly, letting go of her hand. Maybe it's for the best, Jessica said, squeezing his fingers lightly. Sometimes not knowing is a step toward finding something new. Something real. A knock on the door sounded in the silence, making them both flinch. Michael glanced at his watch. It was too early for unexpected guests. Are you expecting someone? He asked, furrowing his eyebrows. Jessica shook her head. No, she replied, standing up. But maybe it's a neighbor. He sometimes comes in the mornings to get his tools. Michael remained seated as she went to the door. But instead of the neighbor's voice, Laura's familiar, strained voice sounded in the hallway. Jessica, I know Michael is here. Please let me in. We need to talk. Jessica froze in place and Michael felt his heart pounding sharply. Laura's here. She's here. Michael, do you want me to let her in? Jessica asked quietly, looking over her shoulder. He stood up, his eyes narrowed. Fear, anger, pain, all the emotions mixed together, causing a storm inside. Finally he nodded. Let her in. It was time to set things straight. Jessica opened the door and Laura walked in, her face tense and her eyes reddened with tears. She looked first at Jessica, then at Michael. The silence that filled the room was heavy and pressurizing. I knew I'd find you here, Laura said, not taking her eyes off her husband. I couldn't wait any longer, Michael. We have to talk. He nodded and gestured to the chair opposite. Laura sat down, her hands nervously tugging at the hem of her skirt. Jessica stood nearby, ready to leave, but Michael stopped her. Stay, he said. She needs to know the truth. Laura glanced at Jessica, bewilderment and jealousy flashing in her eyes. The truth? What are you talking about? Michael sighed and sat down across from her. About us, Laura. About what was and what's to come. You came here to say something, so say it. She lowered her gaze, her lips trembling. I know what I did was awful, Laura began, and her voice trembled. I can't justify myself, but I'm confused, Michael. Everything has seemed so empty since Sophie left. I've been looking for something to bring back a sense of life. And I chose the most horrible way. Yes, I admit I lied to you and it wasn't my first time, but I didn't realize what I was doing and I wanted to get our relationship back that way, but I overdid it and now I realize it. And I'm telling you the truth now in the hopes that you'll forgive me. Yeah, are you crazy? Michael interrupted her, looking her straight in the eye. And you thought you could walk away and come back like nothing had happened? Did you want me to realize that? Do you have any idea what you're talking about? I won't forgive you. Not after what you did. Laura raised her head, tears welling up in her eyes. You were with her, weren't you? She shifted her gaze to Jessica. I know it wasn't just friendship. Yes, Michael answered calmly. We were together. But this isn't just revenge, Laura. It's a reminder of who I was when I was still seen, when I was appreciated. But we can try again, Laura exclaimed, her voice almost pleading. We can go through this together, rebuild trust. Jessica stood silent, watching the conversation while Michael decided how to proceed. The room fell silent again and Michael felt her weight on his shoulders. Laura, I can't go back, he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. You've destroyed what was between us. And I've changed too. All this time I thought we could get through this together. But now I realize I don't want to anymore. Laura lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I've lost everything, she whispered. Michael looked at her sympathetically, but his decision was final. Yes, but it was your choice, Laura. And I made mine. Jessica stepped closer and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Laura sat back in the chair, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was bearing down on them. Tears continued to roll down her face, but she didn't even try to wipe them away. Her gaze darted from Michael to Jessica, and with each passing moment her face grew more distorted with pain and realization. Michael, her voice had been shaking, but now there was something new in it, desperation but also hope. I know it's no use asking for forgiveness. I know I've lost you, but please think of the girls. Sophie and Ellie. We can try for them. We can live under the same roof until they get stronger, until things settle down. Michael looked at Laura, there was no anger in his eyes, just sadness. Laura, I love our daughters more than anything in the world. And I would do anything to make them feel safe and know that we love them. But I can't pretend anymore. We can't stay together for the sake of appearances. It will only make things worse. Jessica, who had been silent until now, took a step back, realizing it was time for her to leave the two of them alone. She gently touched Michael's shoulder and whispered, I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. When she left, Laura crossed her hands in her lap, as if trying to protect herself from invisible pain. What if I change, Michael? What if I prove to you that I'm capable of being who I used to be? Her voice was full of hope, but the question itself sounded hollow. Michael sighed, feeling the tension stiffen his muscles again. It's not about what you can or can't do, Laura. It's about the fact that trust isn't just words and promises. You broke it and it won't be glued back together so easily. I thought our 20 years of marriage meant something immutable, but now I realize it can be destroyed in one weekend. Laura lowered her eyes, her fingers clenched convulsively into fists. It had been a mistake. A stupid, thoughtless mistake, she whispered, almost choking on her own words. I wanted to regain my sense of life, but only now did I realize how much I loved you and how much I was afraid of losing you. Michael stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm. Cars drove by, someone walked down the sidewalk with a dog. But for him, everything had changed. Laura, I don't want to hate you, he said without turning around. But I can't live with you anymore either. I need to figure out who I am without this pain and without your excuses. Laura stood up abruptly, her face hard. Are you talking about pain, Michael? What about me? You don't think it hurts me to see you with Jessica? To know that you found comfort in someone else while I was torn apart? He turned to her, and something new flashed in his eyes, the realization that this wasn't just his battle. You're right, he said calmly. It hurts everyone. But the difference is that you made that choice. You left first. And I was just trying to survive afterward. Laura covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shuddering with new tears. She knew there were no more excuses, no more words that could bring it all back. Silence once again enveloped the room as they stood across from each other, like two strangers who had once been bound by love and trust. Now there was a gulf between them that could not be bridged. Finally Laura looked up, her eyes reflecting acceptance. All right, Michael. If you want a divorce, I won't resist. I'll accept whatever you say, but please don't make this an enemy for the girls' sake. Let them see that we're still a family even if we're not together. Michael nodded, feeling the shadow of anger finally leave, giving way to relief. We're going to be parents, Laura. And that already means a lot. The door to the kitchen creaked softly, and Jessica stepped out without looking at Laura. Her eyes met Michael's, and there was more than understanding in that look. It was support, without words, without conditions. I think I should go, Laura said, not taking her eyes off Michael. I'll pack my things and find a place to stay. We'll discuss it, Michael said softly. Take your time. Laura turned and headed for the door. Her silhouette disappeared over the threshold, and at that moment the room seemed empty. Jessica stepped closer, her fingers barely touching Michael's hand. Are you okay? She asked, her voice barely audible. No, he answered, sinking down onto the couch. But maybe this is the first step to being okay. They sat side by side, and in the silence that came, there was no more pain. Only the quiet hope that there might be something better ahead. The days after his conversation with Laura had turned into a protracted time of reflection and conversation. Michael tried to stay calm for his daughter's sake as the house filled with a silence that had once seemed cozy, but now pressed on, devoid of the joy of family sounds. Laura moved in with her sister to give everyone space to realize what had happened. Ellie and Sophie learned of the divorce when both daughters gathered together in the living room one rare evening. Dad, why did Mom leave? Ellie asked, her eyes glistening with held-back tears. She looked younger than her 17 years, clutching the soft plaid with her hands as if it could protect her from reality. Sophie, more mature and understanding, squinted, trying to catch every nuance in her father's voice. Michael sighed, pondering the words he had to say. The look in Jessica's eyes as she stood in the doorway inspired confidence. Her support was silent but tangible, as if she were holding him through this difficult moment. Girls, this is a difficult moment for all of us, Michael began, his voice calm but a little strained. Mom and I have made the decision that it's best for us to separate. It hasn't been easy, and I know it's painful for both of you. Ellie bit her lip, her eyes widening in surprise. What? Her voice trailed off, and she glanced quickly at Sophie, who sat silent, her fingers clenched into fists. Mom and I decided we couldn't be happy together anymore, Michael said carefully, avoiding unnecessary details. But that doesn't change how much we love you. We are still your family. Sophie finally spoke, her voice firm and a little cold. I knew something was wrong. There had been too much silence in the house lately. Dad, Mom, did she leave because of someone else? Her question was direct, and Michael flinched, surprised at her guess. Yes, Sophie, that's part of the reason, he admitted, lowering his head. But I don't want you to hate her. Your mom had a hard time and she made mistakes just like anyone else. Ellie cried, her sobs muffled and tearful. Sophie put her arms around her, letting her little sister rest her head on her shoulder. We'll figure it out, Ellie, Sophie whispered, looking at her father with an understanding but sad expression. It just takes time. Michael looked at his daughters and felt a deep ache growing in his chest. He realized they had a long road to recovery, but in that moment, despite all the pain, he felt a flash of hope. They were strong, they would get through this together. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the girls had gone to bed, Michael sat in the kitchen with Jessica, wrapping his fingers around a warm cup of tea. She watched him with careful concern. "You did better than I could have imagined," she said, taking a sip. "The girls know you love them. That's the most important thing." Michael nodded, lowering his gaze to the surface of the table. "I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing, Jessica. It hurts to see them suffer. And I feel guilty for finding comfort in you while their world is crumbling." Jessica reached for his hand, her touch soft and reassuring. "You're human too, Michael. And you have a right to be happy. You deserve the support I want to give you. No one says it's going to be easy, but we'll get through this together." He met her gaze and saw in her eyes a reflection of his own fears and hopes. Jessica wasn't just a support for him, she was his future. Maybe a chance to start over, without lies and pain. "Thank you," he said quietly, squeezing her hand. "You have no idea how much it means to me to have you around." "I do," she replied with a warm smile. "And I'm not here to leave." The next morning, Michael met with Laura at the lawyer's office to discuss the terms of the divorce. It was the first face-to-face meeting since that painful conversation at Jessica's house. Laura looked tired, her eyes were red as if she had been up all night. She nervously rubbed the papers on her desk. "Michael, I want you to know that I'm not going to complicate the process," she said as the lawyer entered the room. "I just want the girls to be okay." "I appreciate that, Laura," he said, looking into her eyes. "And I promise I'll do everything I can to make this transition as painless as possible for them." They began discussing details: the house, joint bills, childcare plans. Laura agreed to stay in the house so the girls wouldn't feel like their lives had completely changed. "You can come over anytime you want to see them," Laura said, her voice quiet and full of regret. "I don't want to interfere with your relationship with them." Michael nodded, feeling a bitter wave of gratitude and regret rising inside. "Thank you, Laura," he said. "It means a lot." They signed the papers and the lawyer pushed the folder aside, ending the formal part of the meeting. But before she stood up, Laura looked at Michael, her gaze full of emotion. "I hope that one day you'll find the strength to forgive me," she said. "Not for our sake but for your own." He held her gaze, not knowing what to say. The pain was still raging inside him, but there were sprouts of forgiveness that were slowly working their way through his resentment. "I hope so too," he replied quietly. They parted, each going their separate ways, feeling that this breakup was the beginning of a new phase of life. Months passed and life began to take on a new order. Michael spent more time with his daughters, trying to support them. Jessica became an integral part of his life, but she respected boundaries and didn't rush him. One evening, Allie approached him as he was reading in the living room. "Dad, Jessica is good. I see the way you look at her. You smile more than you used to." Michael put the book aside and looked at his daughter. Her words were simple, but there was deep wisdom behind them. "Thank you, Ellie. It means a lot to me to know that you feel that way." "We'll get through this, Dad," she said as she hugged him. "I know it's going to be hard, but we'll get through this." He hugged her back, feeling tears come to his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt that the future, though uncertain, could be bright. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.